Fortress on a Hill with Henri, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, and Manisha.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henri. My pronouns are he and him. Thank you for joining us today. With me is my co-host, Jovanni. Dude, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing excellent, Henri. Thank you.
And we are here to talk with Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink. She's also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, which advocates for returning the $7 billion of Afghan funds frozen in U.S. banks, ACRE, the Alliance for Cuban Engagement and Respect, and the Nobel Peace Prize for Cuban Doctors Campaign. Medea has been an advocate for social justice for over 50 years, described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday, and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the Los Angeles Times. She was one of the 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace worldwide. She is the author of 10 books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, and Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Her most recent book, co-authored with Nicholas J.S. Davies, is War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea Benjamin, welcome to Fortress on a Hill.
Hello, Henri and Jovanni. Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come talk with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, my dear.
So, I was thinking we get started by talking about Code Pink. Could you tell our listeners about Code Pink, what its goals are, what your participation in it is, and what you see for its future?
Yes, of course. Code Pink started after the 9/11 attacks when George Bush had that color-coded alert system. Yellow, orange, red, be very fearful. And we thought it was to keep people in a state of fear and justify violence like the invasion of Iraq that had nothing to do with 9/11. So we created this other color code, pink, to say that there were other ways of dealing with this, like bringing the perpetrators of the crime to justice and not using it as a justification for more war. And we've been since then focused on militarization of our country. How do we turn that around? How do we move from a war economy to a peace economy? And you asked about my participation. Well, I'm one of the two co-founders. But when I turned 70, I thought, now I think is a time to leave it to the younger generation. So I have retired from Code Pink, which doesn't mean I don't do any of the activism. It means I don't make the decisions. I don't participate in the internal affairs of Code Pink. And I'm really happy and proud to say that our two co-directors now are both women, Muslim women. One is very young in her 20s, and that the new generation of people participating in Code Pink are young people, both women and men. And so it's exciting to see that transition happening.
Giovanni, go ahead and jump in here, man.
Absolutely, yes. So Code Pink has, like you said, Medea, you've been since the war in Iraq, 2003. I was in active duty actually the first time when I first heard about Code Pink, and I believe I saw you on was either one of the interventions that Code Pink does, when a public intervention that the Code Pink was, or it was they were interviewing you or they were mentioning you on the radio. At the time, I was active duty, but I was opposed to the war in Iraq, and most of the time I couldn't find media that was you know openly opposed to the war in Iraq. But I think they mentioned you in one of those radio programs that I listened to. I think it was at the time was NPR or something like that. So I even just researched you, and yeah, and been following you ever since. And I've been following you, Code Pink, how it has developed over the years because it turned into a type. You started out protesting against the war in Iraq at the time, but then it expanded to more to to like you said in Iran, like you said the aggression against Cuba, Venezuela. It expanded so much more. And if you go to the webpage, you have studies, where people can resources people can get to, and studies and articles and everything like that. So you turn like in a kind of educational space as well, not just not just a group that does protests. So I think that's very. I've seen you guys evolve. I think that's very inspirational. I think that's very important to have.
I want to say right up front that we're very, we're, because of the war in Ukraine and because of the aggression against China, there's a lot of people now who are looking for ways to get involved. And so we've got a whole new crew of people, volunteers who want to work. We have something called Summer of Peace, where we give people lots of ideas of things they can do, from the simple thing of putting up a sign in your window, or a peace flag on your, if you have a lawn, or, doing some kind of educational event, like you said, lots of different ways. And we also helped create this group called Peace in Ukraine, which is a coalition of about 100 groups. And there we have a lot of individuals and organizations that participate. So I'm just saying this, that, as we go about this discussion, for people to think, well, if you agree with the things we're talking about and are not involved, there's lots of ways to get involved right now, and lots of dynamism in these organizations these days.
Absolutely. I've even participated in one of those light brigades that was so common back a few years ago. Absolutely, there's a lot of ways to participate. So I want to ask you about the peace organization, Peace in Ukraine organization you just mentioned. You just got back from a trip in Europe, where you attended the Ukraine Summit, the Europe Peace in Ukraine Summit in Vienna, the Global Women for Peace United Against NATO in Brussels, and the Irish Neutrality in Dublin. Can you talk a little bit about those events?
Well, it's been a very busy summer so far, starting out with that summit that we had in Vienna, which brought together people from 32 different countries, including from Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and all over Europe, people from the global south, from Ghana, Cameroon. We had folks from Canada, the US. So it was quite an exciting time to network with people, and really strategize about how we can build a stronger movement calling for ceasefire and negotiations. But I do want to say that the atmosphere in Europe is, in some countries, very restricted and censored, ironically, for those of us calling for peace. In Austria, which is one of the few neutral countries in Europe, there's Switzerland, Austria, and Ireland. There was an attempt to try to pull the plug on our event. Just 2 days before it happened, the Ukrainian embassy in Austria had been pressuring the trade union confederation that was going to be our host to not let us use their facility. And they were successful in getting the trade union to say, no, you can't have it here. So we had to scramble at the last minute to find another place. The same thing when we were doing a press conference. They said, no, you can't have it here. And the press was very negative towards us. I would say everybody at that conference condemned Russia, but the press was calling us Putin apologists. And this I found in many places throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, where people were losing their jobs because they were talking out for peace. Journalists who were writing things that were different from what their governments were saying. or people who were part of building up a peace movement found themselves under tremendous pressure. And then we went to Ukraine. I was with the retired Colonel Ann Wright, who some of your viewers and listeners might know. And we went to Ukraine. And what we found there is that the government and the media are telling people every single day that there is a victory on the battlefield in the near future if we just keep fighting. And a victory means taking back every inch of Donbass, taking back Crimea. And they're seeing on their TV every day blowing up of Russian tanks, blowing up of Russian ships, and a constant sense that the counteroffensive is working. And yet the reality on the ground is very different. There is a terrible, terrible war of attrition, a stalemate. And for those who read the leaked reports from the Pentagon or hear the voices of a lot of former military people and even present day ones who were talking anonymously, they say that it's very unrealistic what the Ukrainians are demanding, what they think they can achieve, and you see a hardening of position on both sides, where the Ukrainians we talked to, many of them now not only hate Putin and the Russian soldiers for the crimes that are being committed there, but also the Russian people, the Russian language, Russian literature, Russian art. I mean, there's a tremendous anti-Russian sentiment that even affects the Ukrainians who are ethnic Russians. Like my family was Jewish ethnic Russians living in both Ukraine and in Russia. Anybody who speaks Russian now as their first language is afraid to speak Russian on the streets in some places like in Western Ukraine where we were. So it's a very dangerous, scary situation where it looks like, we have to find a way for cooler heads to prevail and all sides to be pushed to the negotiating table.
What you mentioned there about, see, a lot of what you mentioned there about how the attitude has conversion in Ukraine. I feel like it was since the beginning of the war, in 2022. I mean, just like a light switch, and it just didn't happen in Ukraine, but this war condemnation of Russia just happened everywhere in the West. You're seeing athletes, um, been athletes were canceled because they were Russian. I recall seeing this soprano, this opera singer, right, being pretty much removed off the stage because she was Russian and she condemned Russian Putin. You saw these Russian channels, and even Americans that work for Russian channels, right? They were pretty much out of a job the next day because everything was just canceled. Everything was just so coordinated, precisely, to have this effect and to manufacture this hysteria against Russia. But I don't think it started in 2022. I think the 8 years of Donald Trump, right, was also leading to this hysteria, this hatred towards Russia, particularly towards Putin, right? And it was just something that it was like a light switch. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, both a light switch and a steady buildup. So the steady buildup in the U.S., there was the Russiagate constantly harping on this idea that it was Russia that interfered in our elections, and that's why Donald Trump won, which is really garbage. It's because Hillary Clinton ran a really bad campaign. And then there was the investing of our tax dollars in Ukraine, billions and billions of dollars before the Maidan uprising in 2014 to build up an anti-war, anti-Russia sentiment. And then when the Maidan uprising turned into a coup, this anti-Russia sentiment was exacerbated, and the U.S. and the West started pouring in weapons and training Ukrainians. So it's interesting because, as you say, there was this steady buildup. And yet you also can say that all of a sudden, uh, all of that turned into this massive hatred and one-sided view with no interest in setting the context for how this war happened, no interest in really understanding that there have been divisions between the East and the West in Ukraine for a long time. No understanding about the real dilemma of Crimea, which was in Russian hands for 200 years and is the home of their a very important warm water port and base. So all of this kind of went by the wayside, and it was just a what as we have seen in the last year and a half now, this continuous drumbeat for more and more weapons to be poured in, as if that was going to lead to some kind of victory, which I don't think it will.
Like you mentioned, the policymakers there, it seems the policymakers understand that a Ukrainian victory is not really possible, right? But at the same time, they keep pushing for attrition and keep putting weapons. And if you look at what happened at the NATO summit and the old pictures that you saw of Zelensky, how pretty much he was outcast among the groups there, the pictures that were shown. I was listening to a very interesting conversation with retired Colonel Scott Ritter when he was talking about that event at the NATO, and what he was talking about is the rebuff that Zelensky, was given in that NATO, right? It's outrageous because Ukraine has pretty much done everything that NATO has asked them to do, sacrifice its people, its land and territory. Yet this condescending attitude of NATO countries, right, towards them and towards Ukraine, it was just spoke volume based on those pictures that was filtered.
It's a tragic catch-22 that Ukraine is now stuck in, because you have the West saying, your future, your fate is with NATO, but we're not going to tell you when, or even set the conditions for you joining. And on the other hand, and saying, you've got to win this war first. And yet we know that Russia is not going to just pick up and leave like that. We know that Russia has the ability to use a nuclear weapon if it really felt that it was losing this war. And so where is Ukraine supposed to go? Just sacrificing more and more of its young men and women as well into this unwinnable war, and yet NATO keeping them dangling this idea that one day you'll become a member, but really knowing that it's not going to happen, because if the war is going to end, it's going to have to be that Ukraine is a neutral country. And at one point, Zelensky accepted that, after about a month into the invasion, when they were hammering out this agreement of 15 points. One of the key points of the agreement is that Russian troops would leave, but that Ukraine would be a neutral country. And I think in the end, that's going to have to be part of the compromise that's made. And yet, how many people are going to continue to die before they sit down and hammer out those compromises?
And this document you mentioned was shown to the African delegation that was recently visiting Moscow. It was shown to them with the signature of Zelensky accepting the terms, right? A month into the war. And it would have been done then. It would have been done then if it wasn't for, by the time, Prime Minister from the UK, Boris Johnson, flew into Ukraine, pretty much telling Zelensky to, not to accept this deal and to keep on fighting. And here we are a year later.
Well, that's right. And I hope we'll be able to go into the issues not only of how this administration, with its neocons like Biden and Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, have gotten us and Ukraine and NATO into this hole. But how we're going to climb out of that, and why is it that in Congress right now we don't have any of the progressive Democrats speaking out who normally would be with us in calling for peace? They're not doing it now, and that the only people who are questioning the blank check, the only people who are demanding that the Biden administration give us their plan, their strategy, are conservative Republicans. And how are we going to turn that around so that it's not just them? It's also people within the Democratic Party, because it's got to be bipartisan.
Almost since the conflict began, that they even the strongest moments of dissent from House and Senate Democrats has always started strong and then inevitably get walked back and walked back and walked back, and a lack of courage to even have the opinion to even say that it's worth even having the question. It makes both perfect sense and no sense at all that the only people that are providing some amount of strong dissent is the Republicans right now, and certainly for their own reasons, but they are the ones that are leading the front.
Well, that's right. And whenever you get a Democrat in the White House, it's harder to get Democrats to question the strategy. But look, there are plenty of Democrats who have questioned Biden on all kinds of other things, on environmental issues, on support for the pipelines, on extending the licenses for drilling. They've gone against him on many, many issues. Why can't they go against him on this life and death issue that could lead to a nuclear war? I think we're referring, Henry, to the letter signed by 29 Democrats back in October of last year, where they said, yes, we want to keep giving the weapons, economic aid, and in addition, let's start negotiations. And for that alone, they were so pilloried by their own party that in 24 hours, they withdrew that. And since then, almost every single one of them has been silent. And I think that is just absolutely outrageous. And we have to do something about it. I want to call your attention to an amendment that was put forward this week in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the military budget. And what this amendment was one put forward by a Republican who was an Army Ranger, a member of the Freedom Caucus. His name is Warren Davidson. And it was the most rational amendment that you can imagine, and very mild. It said the following. It said, tell us why this is in our national interest and what is your definition of victory and how are you going to measure success or failure? What is your diplomatic plan? How much is this going to cost us this year and years to come? And that we're going to withhold the money in the NDAA, and it was only about $300 million that would go to Ukraine until we get this report from you. Well, it had 129 Republicans who voted for it, which is pretty good given that most Republicans are hawks, but it had 0 Democrats, 0. And you got to really think about that. How come they couldn't get one Democrat to say, of course, we need to know what the administration's strategy is on this? And so there's something very positive, though, which is while that amendment lost, they're going to reintroduce it as a standalone bill come September. So those of us who care about this issue have to do what we don't like to do, which is call, contact, bug our congresspeople and tell them they have to support this amendment, whether they're Democrats, whether they're Republicans, we don't care. This is a common sense, it will be a bill now, a common sense piece of legislation, and we want to see their names on this.
So, Medea, so what you're saying there about the congressman, what do you think? Why do you think that Republicans feel more confident and more secure talking against this war, whereas the liberals, Democrats, progressive do not have the same sense of security to go against this policy? going back, and we'll talk about this article uh, later on, but the article that John Pfeffer wrote, The Surprising Pervasiveness of American Arrogance, he talks about that this left, meaning that you, I, that are against this war, right? We are actually against the 65% of progressives in the United States that are for supporting Ukraine unconditionally. Why do you think that environment, why do you think that discord exists?
Well, first, let's remember that it's a Democrat in the White House and there's elections coming up, and the Democratic Party is saying to the Democrats in Congress, be quiet on this national security issue. Let us take the lead on this. We're the ones that know what's going on. We can't show the party as weak on defense, and we've got to show ourselves as united on this issue. So that's one thing, because I'm sure if the tables were turned and it was a Republican like Trump in the White House, we would have Barbara Lee and the squad and a lot of the other Democrats on our side. And we'd have a lot more of the grassroots people that call themselves progressives on our side as well. So that's one thing. It becomes a partisan issue. The other is let's look at this media narrative that has been relentless, and how much stations like MSNBC and a lot of the mainstream media have censored voices like Jeffrey Sachs, like Scott Ritter, like myself, many others who have a different opinion than the one that they're putting out. So that's the narrative that the majority of people are hearing. And also, as we mentioned before, there were many years of Russiagate that people in the Democratic Party got conditioned to think of Russia as interfering in our elections and also as pro-Republican, a friend of Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump has done a lot to push this war by being the first one to lift Obama's restrictions on sending only defensive weapons to Ukraine. He lifted that and started sending offensive weapons to Ukraine. In any case, it is unfortunately a very partisan thing. And there are many people who have called themselves leftists, progressives, called themselves anti-war, been in the anti-war movement with us on other issues, who have had their heads turned around on this issue. And I think it's extremely unfortunate, but I also think that it's going to change. You cited opinion polls, but the public opinion has been changing significantly as time goes by, being very pro-war in the early days, and now more and more people saying, where is this going? How much money are we going to keep pouring into this? And wouldn't it be good to have peace talks? And that's not just Republicans. You see more and more Democrats asking those questions as well. And this is very important as we get closer and closer to the elections, because this will be an albatross around the neck of the Democratic Party, and particularly Biden. And I think, just as he said many months ago that Putin needs an off-ramp, I think Biden needs an off-ramp as well. And we're going to see, I hope, more efforts to begin peace talks, because it's not a popular position, and it's going to become less and less popular, especially if Ukraine is not making advances on the battlefield and Zelensky starts looking for ways to get US/NATO troops directly involved in this war. And that is something that Biden knows would be extremely unpopular. He doesn't want to see it happen. But as you know, war has its own momentum, and you don't know where this is going. And so I think it's going to be in the interest of the Democratic Party to start trying to find a way to move towards the negotiating table.
What is the likelihood of that? Of U.S. Boots on the ground? There are reports of American death already in Ukraine, but mostly as volunteers, what they call volunteers in the international brigades, Ukrainian that volunteer to go over there. There are reports of American and other Western death there, right? But what is the likelihood of, in your opinion, of a direct military involvement in Ukraine? Because that seems to be what the Ukraine leadership is looking for. They're looking for actual, military, U.S. military presence, on the ground. Uh,
Right. Remember back when there was that missile that went astray, and Zelensky immediately said it was a Russian missile and killed 2 people in Poland. He was ready and pushing to say, okay, now NATO invoke Article 5, which means, you have to get directly involved in this. And thank goodness it wasn't a Russian missile, it was a Ukrainian one. But that could happen anytime, whether by accident or by design, where the Ukrainians do some kind of action like that to push for direct involvement of NATO forces. And let's remember that just last week, Biden brought up 3,000 more reserve troops, sending them to Europe, where there are already 80,000 troops. Let's remember we have bases very close to the Russian border in Romania and Poland. And so I think, despite the fact that Biden very much wants to keep U.S. troops out of there, as you said, Giovanni, this is something that is very much in the interests of Zelensky. And so we have to be careful about where this is going. And that's why it's so important for us to build up the opposition here in the United States, because Zelensky is not going to go to the negotiating table unless he is pushed by Biden.
There has been a huge increase in the amount of involvement by the CIA that and that would make perfect sense for the manner and the way that this war has continued. And so it's what we're not seeing behind the lines and stuff. It doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't using other assets in whatever way it can, as long as it's not somebody in a camouflage uniform who's raised their right hand and says, I'm going there to fight. But the alligator jaw is really beginning to close in on Biden, especially as we get closer to the election in 2024.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have been in the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and it really feels like that same kind of mission creep. As you get more and more involved, you have special forces in there, you have CIA people, you have lots of Americans who are there. I saw so many Americans while I was there who were involved in some aspect of the transport of this massive amount of equipment that we are sending into Ukraine, and all of the training that needs to go on, and the repair of all this equipment. So, yeah, more and more mission creep. And where does this lead? It could lead to direct military intervention. It could lead to a fighting that goes beyond Ukraine itself and Russia and into a NATO country. Um, it could lead to a wider war throughout the European continent, which is why so many of our friends that we met with in Austria are much more advanced than we are in terms of building up an anti-war movement. They can get tens of thousands of people out on the streets, where we have not been able to do that since the war began.
That's
More and more public opinion is on our side. That doesn't mean people are ready to get out in the streets over this issue.
Yes, and it seems like any type of attempt to get people on the street, right, gets pretty much shouted down, knocked down, uh, and it seems very, very, very coordinated. Because I was going to go to that Rage Against the War Machine event that happened in 2023, which I believe you were scheduled to speak, but there was a reaction of you speaking, just like the reaction of other people, like Scott Ritter. He was supposed to speak as well, but there was a reaction to him being there as well. And there was so much animosity to this event from both libertarians and from both people that in the past has come out against war and everything, but they just feel like they didn't want this to happen. They didn't want this to grow, and they just wanted to stomp this down from the get-go. Uh,
Well, the issue there, Giovanni, is so much how do you build up an anti-war movement at this moment?
Mhm.
And there's two different perspectives. One is we're so small that we need to build with whoever agrees with us on this. And there is a famous quote from Martin Luther King who says, if you're comfortable with your coalition, then your tent is not big enough. So meaning that you might have to work with libertarians who you disagree with on all kinds of issues. You might have to work with Republicans that you disagree with. And that's one way of looking at this. The other way of looking at it is that we have to build up an anti-war movement that is consistent with our values. And we have to get people involved who we work with on other issues, whether it's issues about anti-racism, fairness for immigrants, issues about poverty, issues about how do we spend our money and why don't we have money for Medicare for all? Why don't we have money to forgive student loans? Why and shouldn't environmentalists who care about the possibility of a nuclear war or the blowing up of a nuclear power plant be with us on this issue? The religious community who is against war, who supports the Pope efforts for peace. Let's build up that community that we feel more comfortable with. So those are two different ways of looking at this. And within my own organization, both existed. The controversy about my speaking did not come from the people organizing the event. It came from within my own organization. And out of deference to my colleagues, I decided not to speak. And I think we had very comradely discussions internally because we didn't want to make this a division that blows up the organization. But I understand both sides. And it was interesting in Europe, for example, to talk to the Italians. And we said to them, how in the world do you get so many people out on the street? Who do you organize with? And do you work with the forces on the right? And they said, no, we work with the religious community. We work with the labor community, which we haven't been able to do in this country. They have a very strong peace movement that they've developed over many years. And they say we don't organize with the right. The same is true in Germany, where there is a right-wing party that's very much against this war. And the peace folks that we work with say, we don't work with them either. If they show up at our events, we can't do anything about it, but they're not part of the organizing. So, it's different in different places.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I found that very disheartening because I was trying to push also within my organization, right, to have a presence at least, and I was getting all kinds of resistance as well. Very unfortunate. So let's move on to this article that you wrote. Surprising pervasiveness of pro-war propaganda, right? And this was in response to another article, which I mentioned earlier, the surprising pervasiveness of American arrogance. And this article, it's funny because this article, Henry shared it with us, the group, with us here at Fortress on the Hill, and we read it and we're discussing it, and then we were thinking about writing a response to it. And then the next day, I saw your response. I said, look at Medea's response, right? And I think you were you were very on point and pretty much point, rebutting point for point that Pfeffer was making in his article. And I think one of the things that, and it's funny because a lot of the arguments he was making in his article was arguments that were made at the beginning of this conflict, and were arguments that I was coming across when I was trying to make the case for us to have a response to this conflict. And one of the arguments was that he made about, erasing the Ukrainian people, which you replied that which Ukrainian people, which which Ukrainian people you're talking about? Because there's a million of Ukrainian people with different opinions. There's different ethnicity, religious, and stuff like that. So which one are you talking about? And the one he talks about that this subgroup of the left, like I guess meaning us, that we're arrogant, Like, we don't want to speak to Ukrainian people, and then we're not in line with the 65% of the larger American progressiveness. And one thing in particular that I got from his article, I don't think you mentioned, I think you did mention it, but you didn't go too much deep into it, is there's this tendency here in the West, United States, to ignore the plight of the people of Donbass that have been in continuous warfare since 2014. They've been bombarded since 2014. These are people who are ethnic Russians but Ukrainian citizens, Um, and also something that's ignored in his article was, the Nazi problem in Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, having just been in the western part of Ukraine, people have said to me, well, if you went to the Donbass, you would hear a very different story. I know people who just came back from Donbass and have a very different story. They say that they have been attacked since 2014 by the Ukrainians and particularly by the Azov battalion from early on. They are the ones who have been discriminated against and victimized by nationalist Ukrainians. And so, yes, there's the issue of minimizing the role of the neo-Nazis, of minimizing the plight of people in the Donbass, and minimizing the legitimate question about who should control Crimea and what the people of Crimea want at this point, because they'll tell you, well, there was ethnic cleansing of people in Crimea and they brought in ethnic Russians. And, whatever that history is, the fact now is that the majority of people in Crimea are ethnic Russians, are Russian speaking. And there have been so many different referendum, and there should be another one with international monitors to allow the people of Crimea to decide for themselves. But most people that you talk to who are from Crimea will say to you they were very happy being part of Russia. So, yes, it depends at who you talk to. But another thing, Jovanni, that I think is so important that we mentioned in that article, but it's really important today when the Russians have pulled out of this grain deal and the price of wheat has gone up, that this is a conflict that affects the entire world. And so it's not just what do the quote Ukrainians think, it's how do we stop a conflict that is uh, increasing the level of hunger throughout the world, especially in the poorest countries? How do we stop a conflict that is increasing the price of energy that's affecting people around the world? And how do we stop this from becoming a larger conflict, including the potential of a nuclear one? So you have to step out as well and look at the larger issues and say that sometimes there are conflicts that are just internal to a country. They're horrific, but they're internal, like Sudan right now. And sometimes there are conflicts that are horrific internally, but affect the entire world. And this is one of them. So the rest of us in the world, the global majority, should have a say about this as well.
But you mentioned the survey that you mentioned, the referendum. I just came across the USAID survey that was given in 2013, where it asked the same question to the Crimean people, and how do they feel, and the majority of them feel, I think it was 60%, feel very much Russian. Hey, so it makes you wonder if Ukraine measured success before even going to the table of peace, that before that they have to recover Ukraine, they have to recover Crimea. What are they planning to do with the 60+% of the population who feel Russian in Crimea? It just makes you wonder.
That's right. And I think, in some ways we could say that whatever Putin's strategy was, it seems like he wanted to put a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. He wasn't able to do that. And the conflict and the issues that have to be discussed revolve around Donbass and Crimea, not around all of Ukraine. And so in that same vein, it has to be taken into account, what do the people in Crimea and Donbass want? And we have seen, like you talked about, the peace plan that Putin waved around and showed the heads of state from Africa. But, there have been many attempts at making peace. And there have been many governments, from Turkish government to the Israeli government. How ironic is that? To the Pope, to the 6 African heads,
Brazil.
Brazil, the Mexican president, and the Chinese. And I think the Chinese are the most important because they have the most leverage with Russia. And when people say, oh, it's nice to talk about peace talks, but how are you going to get Putin to the peace table? I say the Chinese. The Chinese really could put a lot of pressure on Russia to come to the table, just like the US could put a lot of pressure on Zelensky to come to the table. And that's why it was so disappointing when the Chinese came out with their peace plan that the US dismissed it, just like it's dismissed every other peace plan. Instead of saying, okay, here are these points. We agree with 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. We disagree with 8, 9, 2, whatever. And let's sit down and talk about it. And let's sit down and say, how are we going to get the two parties to the table? The US didn't do that. The US has sabotaged every attempt at a peace talk. And so that gets me back again to this issue of us. And one thing on the positive side, I don't know, Henry and Jovanni, if you both agree, is that with the election coming up, we now see a number of candidates in the Republican, Democrat, and Green Party who are talking about the need for negotiation. And that opens up a lot of space for all of us to be joining in this discussion. And so that's something that gives me a lot of hope, because these candidates are reaching millions and millions of people. And I watch, what the reaction of audiences, and I see that these are issues that get them the most applause, because people don't want to see the US keep pouring our tax dollars into this unwinnable war. So we have an ability, as the election season draws closer, to get more and more people not only to agree with us in theory, but hopefully to get involved in mobilizing and building a real anti-war movement.
So I wanted to ask you about your recent book, War in Ukraine. I just picked it up a few days ago, and I'm really enjoying reading it. Can you share with the listeners a bit about what you intended to do with that book, with the kind of stuff that you want to inform people about?
My co-author and I had been writing some articles about this before the war began. And in December, we wrote an article laying out 3 different scenarios that could happen, and the likelihood of each. And our third scenario was a Russian invasion, which we said was the most unlikely. And so, with egg on our face, we felt, we better dive into this a little more and really understand the whole context of this. And what we wanted to do, and I think we accomplished, was creating a primer, a short book. People told us that they appreciate that they could sit down in a couple of sessions and get through it. It's short, it's readable, and it's kind of a 101. What are the basics in terms of what is some of the history? We don't go back a lot. We talk more about the recent history, particularly what happened in 2014. What was that whole Maidan uprising about? What is the context of U.S. involvement? What has been the importance of the NATO expansion? And it is quite remarkable when you delve into it to see all of the people from so many different walks of life who predicted this instability if indeed NATO expanded, and predicted a war. And we look into what happened when the war broke out. What was the kind of censorship of the media, both in Ukraine, in Russia, and here in the United States as well. Jovanni, you talked about that when you mentioned US people who got their shows canceled because they were on platforms like RT. Um, we talk about the racism in the refugee issue, and how the a majority of Ukrainians are white Ukrainians, and those are the ones who were welcomed with open arms, not only in Poland, but all around the world. And those who weren't white were not welcomed, just as there was a separate line created for Ukrainians on the border of the US to process them immediately, while there were people who had been living in horrific, dangerous conditions for many months on the Mexican border who were not white and were not allowed in. And we talk about what are some of how has this war been progressing, and give our ideas for where this is going. And I must say, I reread the book recently and was amazed at how much our analysis and predictions hold up. There were some things that we learned after the book that actually fortified our analysis. For example, when we were writing the book, I was wondering why in the world didn't the Europeans, the French and the Germans, who were party to the Minsk Agreement in 2015, why didn't they do more to push the Ukrainians to fulfill their end of the bargain? And we saw in his separate interviews by the heads of France and Germany at the time, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, saying, well, we really didn't mean it as a peace agreement. We really meant it to buy time so that we could arm the Ukrainians. We also saw a reaffirmation of our analysis about how the West sabotaged the peace talks early on after the war began. We cite the Turkish officials who say that. We cite the articles that came out in pro-Ukrainian newspaper in Ukraine. We cite officials in Russia who said that. But then there was a confirmation that came out after the book was published by the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Naftali Bennett, who said he was involved in the negotiations and they were coming close to an agreement on a ceasefire, and then the U.S. blocked it. So we're going to do an updated version of the books soon that adds in some of these very critical examples of how our analysis was spot on. So I'm glad that you're reading the book, because I think it does give people a lot of elements for discussing this issue with people who don't agree with them. We tell people to buy it and then pass it on to their friends or relatives who they've been fighting with on this issue.
Even CIA chief William Burns predicted this war back in 2008 when he wrote the paper "Niet means Niet," talking about that for the Russians, further NATO expansion, it's a red line for them.
Well, I would love to have a conversation with William Burns, a frank conversation to understand where he stands on this, because he knows Russia. He knows the Russians. He predicted this. He said this is a red line, not just for Putin, but the whole Russian power brokers. And, you think, how can this guy be in this position now? And why aren't they using him as a mediator? Well, lo and behold, it turns out that he has been sent to Ukraine to talk to Zelensky. And I'm sure they talked about how are we going to move to negotiations and try to wind up this war. Yet on the other hand, he is running the CIA that, as we said earlier, is very involved in the intricacies of the war itself. But I had hoped that he could be somebody who could be tapped to move us towards the peace table.
Also, Medea. So I read a lot of, I follow a lot of, I've been following this war since the beginning, since before actually, since 2014. That's when I started having interest in it and just following what's going on. But I read a lot of and follow a lot of media from not just the West, but also the global South. So I follow media from Latin America, Telesur, Cuba, from Turkish media, Chinese media, Indian media, media from South Africa, right? So I listen to the discourse in these other medias, and the discourse and the conversation is totally different than than here in the West. Um, you see the BRICS countries talking about BRICS expansion. There's more countries. I think there's 30 more countries wanting to join BRICS. And for those who don't know what BRICS is pretty much it's kind of an informal, but it's now becoming formal economic bloc between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And you have more countries wanting to join this organization, right? I listened to recently the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, right? We was talking about they were trying to pressure him into condemning the Russians, and they were trying to make the case that he was somehow providing weapons to the Russians and whatnot, and try to block his port, the port of South Africa. We're seeing Lula recently talk about that everyone is tired about this war now. We should go, we should start going to talk to the peace table. Cuba furthering relations with Russia and China, and the whole thing about the de-dollarization happening right now, which no one in the mainstream press is, so they're kind of ignoring this, And can you? Cause I know you have a lot of insight about Latin America, etc. Right? Why the different discourse in the global South compared to us here?
I think you know the answer to that very well, which is 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine of the U.S. interference in Latin America, the U.S. manipulating, overthrowing democratic governments, training right-wing torture military, paramilitary groups. I mean, all of the insidious things that the U.S. has done to Latin America, the sanctions, the brutal sanctions that they have imposed now for 60 years on Cuba, but they've also imposed on Nicaragua and Venezuela. I mean, it's just awful. And this is all done under the idea that the U.S. has the right to dictate what happens in its own, quote, backyard. And so a lot of people in Latin America laugh when they say, well, wait, doesn't Russia have any of its own backyard, any of its own interests? Any of its own ability to say, hey, wait, we won't allow for the U.S. to have a stranglehold, a base along our border of Ukraine. And let's look at recently when there has been this unsubstantiated rumor about China having a spy base in Cuba. There was all this hullabaloo and people saying, this is unacceptable. This can't happen. We got to find out what's going on. And if there is a base, we're just got to go in and get rid of it, bomb it. Come on. This is the same country, the United States, that won't accept that Russia has any legitimate security interests. And just this week, there was a meeting in Europe with the Latin America organization called CELAC and the European Union. And they wanted to get this joint group to condemn Russia as part of the final declaration. And the Europeans were pushing hard, and a number of the countries in Latin America were pushing back, especially Mexico and Brazil, and saying, no, we're not going to condemn Russia. They see it more, not only the hypocrisy of the United States, but they see it as a proxy war between the US and Russia. Now, we talked earlier, Jovanni, about the critics against people like us who are saying that we don't give agency to the people of Ukraine, and they hate it when we call it a proxy war. But people in Latin America, people in the global South, and now I like the term that people are using, which is the global majority, do see it as a proxy war, and they don't want to get involved. They might feel strong-armed, or they might feel compelled because they do not like Russian invasion. They do not like all of the killing and the bombing and the horrific things that the Russians are doing in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean they want to abide by NATO-imposed sanctions. It doesn't mean that they want to take sides in general in this war. And so that's what we see in terms of the global majority of saying a quote that I loved of Lula, which came after he was invited to the White House by Biden, who was pushing him to supply weapons to Ukraine. And he said, what the Ukrainians need is an interlocutor who will talk to the Russians about the terrible mistake they made invading Ukraine, and will talk to the Ukrainians about the need to go to the peace table. He said, we don't want to send weapons. We don't want to join this war. We want to end this war. And I think that's an important note for us to echo, because it does represent the sane position, but also the position of the global majority. So it's important when people say to us, oh, you're on the side of Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're on the side of Matt Gaetz, you're on the side of all these racists in Congress. We turn around and say, no, we're on the side of the global majority.
So I think that's probably a pretty good place for us to wrap it up today. Medea, thank you so much for coming and spending time with Jovanni and myself and talking about this very important conflict and how it's affecting not only what's happening there in Eastern Europe, but around the world. Tell us where the folks can find your work, and do you have anything coming up in the near future?
Yes, I'm so glad we can end on the activist note. People can go to codepink.org to learn more about the Summer of Peace and volunteer. They can also go to peaceinukraine.org, which now only meets once a month. So it's an hour of your time once a month, but you'll be together with people around the country and some people around the world who are working on these issues. And we do some brainstorming together and come up with lots of ideas. So that's peaceinukraine.org. And one of the things that came out of that Vienna conference are global actions, starting September 30th and the first week of October. So we're encouraging people to do actions during that week. So those are some of the things we have going on, the places that you can go to get involved. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk this evening.
Thank you for joining us, Medea. Thank you for the treat.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you for giving us your time. And that's it for us here at Fortress on a Hill. We hope you all take care, and we'll see you again next time. Later. Money is tight these days for everyone, especially in the lingering shadow of COVID. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Ren Jacob, Rick Coffey, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, Helgeberg, and Status Quo Podcast. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/FortressOnAHill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not be